different company names that will be substituted depending on which OEM is using this. And we can actually see this live. There's actually a third one I've added. It's not room on the slide, but you can see here the actual file that drives this. So this file is just passed through from through the DITA Open Toolkit. We store it in the resources area and then write it into a JavaScript folder in the output. And so when we'll look at it in a minute, when the HTML is loaded, this file is loaded along with the other JavaScript routines, and this variable then is then available for JavaScript. So the next part of doing this is working on the query string. As I mentioned before, the query string is used to indicate which OEM and which device or which company name we want to use, or which company type. So the query string, you're probably familiar with this, but just to refresh, the query string is a part of the URL, comes after the actual HTML file name, and it's separated with a question mark. And while you can have any text that you want, really, in the query string, the convention is to divide it into essentially a key and a value. So in this case, we have two parts passed in the query string. We have dev equals cakes, and the operator, or OEM, and we identify it as OEMB. So what would happen when the customer was, or the programmers working for the customer were setting up a call to help, say the user clicked on their help button, then the developer would then code up a URL to invoke the help, and they would specify this is the device. Whoops, I always do that. This is the device, cakes, and this is the operator, or OEM. So this is for OEMB. And at this point, the programmer would have this information at hand. That is, the program itself would have this information readily available when it was invoked, because again, it's being invoked dynamically. Now, when this HTML file, called frameset, very imaginatively, when frameset.html is called, then one of the first things it does is it opens a file called locale.js. Locale.js is just a JavaScript file that indicates several things that, it loads in a few subroutines and then indicates several things that have to happen. Specifically, it assigns some variables. Now, but before it can assign the variables, what locale does is it calls a function called getArgs. We've written this. If you look on the internet, you can find various forms of it. I'm talking and poking around at the files at the same time, so hang on a second. I want to bring in this file. All right. So here we see the file. The getArgs function, like I say, you can find various forms of this on the internet. But what this one does, very similar to all of them, it essentially takes apart the query string that the user associated. That's this location search substring one. So it takes the actual full URL that the user used to invoke a page or to open the HTML file, and then it divides the that string, the whole URL, using the ampersand. And oh, that's right. I'm sorry. The substring one actually is the this is the query string portion. So this is everything in that URL after the question mark. And so what we do then is then we divide that query string up at the ampersand. So we divide it into two separate sets of information. The dev equals cakes and the oper equals OEMB. And then we just go through and tear them apart. Essentially, I'll let you take a look at that later, but just to summarize, what happens at the end of getArgs, it passes back a string, it passes back the query string as an array. So we have args.dev then contains the value cakes. So you can see here the user passed in cakes as the dev and OEMB as the opper, and args.oem then contains OEMB. So what query-string does then, what getArgs does then, is it tears apart the query string and hands us variables, so then we can decide what to do based on those variables. So talking a little bit more about locale.js. Now, one of the reasons we did this was there was some things that we had to do that were locale dependent. And actually, in the actual implementation, locale.js did a lot more that was locale dependent. But as I said, one of the things that we did have to do was we had to set a default operator for each we had to set a default OEM for each language, and you'll see that in a minute. What we did here, though, so locale.js, as we said, calls getArgs. So now we have our args, our arguments, in a variable, and then using this test notation, what we do is we say, if there actually is a value defined for args.dev, then use that value, args.dev. So if there isn't, then use cakes as the default. And similar for the operator, if we have args.operator, if that actually exists after running getArgs, then just use args.operator, or in this case the default operator is OEMA. The next thing that locale.js does, and this is really important because locale.js is actually invoked from the frame set, we create an object in which we're going to hold a lot of strings. And so this is a very handy thing to do in JavaScript. Dang, I always do that. What you can do is create a variable and define it as a new object. And when this is done in the frame set, this object is available to all the other frames, all the other HTML documents that load in the frames of the frame set. And all they have to do is say top, which means the frame set file, top dot loc strings. And so now we can get to all of the objects that are in this loc strings variable. So this is a nice way of storing information and keeping it in a single place for locating things. This way, from locale.js, we can set all of the values that we need to for loc strings and have them available to us later on. And so here we go, and we actually say loc strings dot device name. So we're going to essentially create an associative array here. Loc strings dot device name equals. And now here comes a part where we actually use the JSON file for pulling information out. So what we're going to say is whatever was used as the dev variable, index that, and whatever is used as the operator variable, use that to index. And so if we look here now, if we go into our JSON file and see dev's dev operator for cakes OEM, so the device name, cakes, OEMA, and we have the variable or the string, let them eat cake. So this is how we access information from our JSON file. I should say, this is a very lightweight example. We can have JSON files that are much, much larger, and we could have just done this statically. We wouldn't have to necessarily use the JSON file, but as it turned out, there was a lot more information we had to store. And this was the best single point we could use. This gave us a single file that we could move around, and we could store all this information in it. So just as with the device name, we can also say loc strings image, and we'll